Go.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Chris. Good to be with you guys tonight. I appreciate everybody attending tonight's presentation brought to you by Breaking the Chain. As Jeremy said, I'm a pilot, aviation educator, aviation writer for Plane and Pilot magazine. But really, my passion is helping pilots and instructors learn how to deal more effectively with the inherent risks of aviation activities. And my other passion is exploring wild places in backcountry airplanes on big tires and particularly on floats. So the guys tonight will be helping with the technology and watching the chat for questions, and we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. And as you heard, the session's being recorded, and Jeremy will make sure that you know how to access that later. So to kind of set the stage for tonight, perhaps many of you like us have read accident reports and wondered a bit about the pilots involved. Maybe some of us have even thought reading those reports that I'd never do such a dumb thing. Like you, I've tried to figure out how sometimes expert pilots with more experience and skill than I have make critical mistakes that sometimes can lead to accidents. Other times I've done things that made no sense and left me wondering what was I thinking when I made those decisions. And so we're trying to understand this whole process. And to begin with, I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to tell you a couple stories. So let's see if we can get this going. Okay. Hopefully, I can't see it for sure, Jeremy, but if hopefully that's got the screen up. Is that showing?
It's showing up very well.
Okay. All right, good. So I'm going to flip over. So I want to tell you a story about a trip from a number of years ago. I was up in Alaska in a Super Cub, and I'd finished up. I'd been up there for several weeks, and I was getting ready to head home. And I had left from Palmer, Alaska that morning and made my way across the Canadian border. And my intention was to end up in a Canadian airport called Watson Lake, and very famous site of the World War II effort to deliver material to the Russians, and was really kind of part of the reason that they created the Alaska Highway. And it's an iconic airport. And I made my way along, stopped a couple times for fuel. And as I got within about 50 or 60 miles of Watson Lake, the weather was getting worse and worse. There was a little bit of convective activity, and it was starting to get toward dark. And the Canadians don't really encourage VFR flight at night. So I needed to get there before it got sundown or before it got dark. And the weather was getting worse, and I was really pressing because I wanted to get there. The difference was if I got to Watson Lake, it meant I could stay inside. They would let us stay in the old terminal building rather than have to pitch a tent in the rain and stay out in the cold and the wet. So highly motivated to get there. The closer I got, the worse the weather got, and there were flashes of lightning and convective activity moving toward the airport. And I got within just a few miles of it, and I happened to look down, and there was a remote strip. Nobody there, but it was a place to land. And I really thought that the smart thing to do at this point would have been to land there on that strip. I'd be down in time to get the tent out and get set up, but it would mean that I wouldn't get to the comforts of getting all the way to Watson Lake, and I'd have to deal with the fact that you're not the apex predator in that part of the world either. So I decided that I would press on to Watson Lake, and it worked out. I got there in the rain and just at dark and got the airplane tied down and got inside. But it wasn't, in retrospect, a very smart decision. Would have been much more prudent to have stopped short and gone ahead and taken the option that I ended up not taking. All right, so there's a look at the old building there at Watson Lake. But tonight we're going to concentrate on a different story, and that's the story of American Airlines Flight 1420. And first of all, I want you to understand I am not an airline pilot. My experience is almost all in general aviation. But I have many friends who work for the airlines, including one who just retired from American and who actually flew with one of the crew members on the same MD-80 series airplane. So just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective and sort of set the stage here, this accident occurred on the 1st of June back in 1999, and it was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 that flew from Dallas-Fort Worth over to Little Rock, which was not a real long flight. They left out of DFW at 10:40 p.m. behind time, 2 hours and 15 minutes late. And there were thunderstorms in the forecast, including a chance for severe storms. And so they push back, they get going, and while they're en route, the crew is advised by the dispatcher that there was an area of clear weather, a lack of thunderstorms, but that the storms were moving toward the airport. And the dispatcher suggested to the crew that they hurry if possible. So, a little look at who's on board. This is Captain Richard Bushman, 48 years old, over 10,000 hours, and obviously highly experienced. And one of the key things to kind of keep in the back of your mind is that he was a check airman for American, and he's flying with Michael Origal. And Michael is younger, 35 years old, got quite a bit of experience, but not much in airline equipment, and he was a recent hire at American. So you can already see that there's a little bit of a dynamic because you got a check airman flying with the new hire. So once they get in the terminal area, they decide that they probably need to kind of hurry up to get there before the weather. And on the intercom, you can hear one of them, the captain says, "We need to get over there quickly." And the first officer reports, "Yep, I see lightning." And the captain says, "Yep, I see it." But at this point, the airport is still in the clear. And, you have to realize that this is sort of normal stuff in thunderstorm season. Crews oftentimes have to assess the threat, change the plan, deviate to an alternate, or hold as needed. It depends on, and they really depend a lot on their own experience and their judgment, as well as what they can see, what they can learn from the weather. So this is just sort of routine business to have to deal with these kind of vagaries of a decision to make. But we move forward a little bit in time now, and Little Rock Approach advises that a thunderstorm is moving through the area, and the winds are now 280 at 28, gusting 44. So the crew talks about it, and they discuss the limits for landing on a wet runway in crosswinds. This is sort of their tactical decision-making at play here. The captain that I'm talking about is fairly convinced that it's going to work out, and so about 5 minutes later, ATC gives him an update, and he says the wind's kind of kicking around here a bit, and it's now 3:30 at 11. Well, that's down quite a bit, so the first officer says, well, that's a little better. And ATC adds, and right now we have a wind shear alert. So the captain decides to change the approach. They were originally set up for 2-2 left, and because of the way the weather looks, they're going to change it over and go land on the opposite end on 4 right. So ATC vectors the airplane away from the airport for several minutes, and you got to figure out that while this is going on, that means that their onboard weather radar is no longer pointed toward the airport. So they really don't have a clear view of the weather. They also don't have a real clear view out the window of the airplane. The captain really can't see it much, but the first officer can see it a little better, so he reports, hey, I've got the airport in sight. And he's basically encouraging the captain to continue the flight. So a few minutes later, ATC gives them another update. And they say the second part of the storm is now moving through, and the wind is 340 at 16, gusting 34. The first officer suggests, hey, let's make a short approach. Let's try to get in before it gets any worse. The captain, who still doesn't have the runway in sight, basically depends on the first officer to help him find it. And about that time, the first officer says it's the storm's going right over the top of the airport. And so about a minute and a half later, the captain says, "See, we're losing it. I don't think we can maintain visual." And so ATC now starts vectoring them toward the ILS approach rather than for the visual. But the problem with that is that means they've got to widen out to a longer final in order to intercept the ILS final approach course. And that puts them closer to where the worst of the storm is. So the first officer asked them if they can turn them on to the localizer as close as possible to the approach course. At about 52 seconds later, the captain says, "We're going right into this," and ATC now says, "Hey, the airport has heavy rain. Visibility is now less than a mile. Runway 4 RVR is down to 3,000 feet. The winds are 350 at 30, gusting 45. The first officer, who's obviously, under a lot of strain here, incorrectly reads back the report as 030 at 45, American 1420. So he misread the wind direction. Instead of 350, he thought it or said it as 030, which makes it a lot better for runway 4. It's not to their thinking, it's not as big a crosswind. About a minute later, they discussed the limits for the conditions and decided that they were legal to continue. So about 20 seconds later, the captain calls for landing gear down. And by the way, the gear extension is the 6th of 10 items on the before landing checklist. So they're kind of skipping stuff on the checklist. And they get, just a few minutes later, a few seconds later, they get another wind shear alert, including wind gusting to 45. And in the heat of all this, they fail to complete the remaining items on the before landing checklist, which included, most importantly, a need to arm the auto spoilers. And the captain, thinking about the conditions that they're getting into, tells the first officer who's flying to add 20 to the approach speed due to the gust and wind shear, but didn't mention anything about the crosswind because they had misheard the wind. So soon thereafter, ATC advises runway 4 RVR is now down to 1,600 feet, which further reduces the allowed crosswind limitations to 10 knots. And it was below the landing minimums for the ILS, but because they were already in the approach, they continued. And the first officer who is watching this, captain, now decides he's going to fly the airplane. And he says, "Hey, you haven't called for final flap extension." And he also misses several required call-outs and fails again to complete the landing checklist. So they continue the approach, and at 49 and 12 seconds, the captain says, "This is a can of worms." But he finally, late in the game, spots the runway. When they get it, they notice that they're off course and they're drifting to the right. This is because of the crosswind. And the captain says, "I can't see it." And but then they get a visual contact back just before touchdown. And the warning sounds off, and they get a sink rate warning twice right before touchdown. So they're obviously in an unstable approach from 1,000 feet down to the touchdown point. So they touch down right of center and immediately begin sliding to the right. The auto spoilers do not deploy because they never got armed. So the airplane veers left and right and then departs the left side of the runway at high speed. And on the cockpit voice recorder or sound of the microphone, you can hear heavy rain and hail striking the airplane. The captain now, in an attempt to try to get things back under control, applies excessive reverse thrust, which blanks the rudder, reducing his ability to control the airplane. So the result of this was that the airplane departed the runway, collided with the approach lights on the opposite end of the runway, split open, and caught fire. Unfortunately, the captain and 10 passengers were killed, and 110 people on board received either serious or minor injuries. And as you might expect, what would happen in a situation like this is that the NTSB looked at it and they blamed the crew. Here's the findings. Flight crew's failure to discontinue the approach when severe thunderstorms and their associated hazards to flight operations had moved into the airport area, and the crew's failure to ensure that the spoilers had extended before touchdown. Feeling was if the spoilers had deployed properly, they would have been able to get it stopped before they ran off the end. So they also mentioned there were some contributing factors, which were impaired performance resulting from fatigue. Remember, this crew started the day early in the morning on the West Coast, ended up flying into Dallas, had a delay waiting on weather and an incoming crew and airplane, ended up having to change airplanes, so they're late getting out of DFW for Little Rock. It's late in their duty cycle, and they're obviously tired. And then they mentioned the impaired performance resulting not only from fatigue, but the situational stress associated with trying to land under the circumstances they were facing. And they mentioned continuation of the approach to a landing when the company's maximum crosswind component was exceeded. And then the third item was the use of reverse thrust greater than 1.3 EPR after landing. So, like a lot of times, this is where it sort of stops. The NTSB figures out who's at fault and who to attach blame to, and that's kind of they write their report and they move on. And so we kind of say, well, is that the end of the story? But I'm here to suggest to you that maybe it's not. Maybe there's more to it and some things we maybe want to be aware of. You know, the question I think we have to ask is, why do people like this, who are highly skilled, very experienced professionals, do such seemingly inexplicable things that, like this one, can occasionally lead to disaster? Why did the crew continue into the storm? How could they miss arming the spoilers? Why would the captain use excessive reverse thrust? And again, many of us would read this accident report, well, I just can't believe they did that. And so, in a way, you can think of this as sort of being the first story. We find the people responsible, we hold them accountable, and that's the end of it. But I think we need to look to something that might be called the second story. So let's see if we can explore that a little bit. And the source for this kind of comes from a book that a guy named Sidney Decker wrote called The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And his point is that what we usually call human error is often maybe more a systemic problem, with the vulnerabilities contained inside the organization and the structure that they operate in. So he's talking about a system. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's not just the crew and the things that they do wrong. It also includes things like the airplane. It's avionics, it's automation, the redundancies, the way the systems are built and the way they work. The pilots themselves and their training and their experience, which we've already looked at a little bit. And then the operation itself, such as standard practices, checklists, regulations, and maintenance on the airplane. And then consider the environment, such as the airports that they're operating into and facilities that they had and the routes they're flying. But he also points out something I found really interesting and that I know I'm guilty of. And he talks about some biases that we bring to this, primarily something called hindsight bias, which says when we know the outcome, like we do in this case, that it's really easy to exaggerate our ability to predict the results and to believe that the crew should have been able to prevent the accident. I mean, if you know how it ended and you know it ended poorly, then it's really easy to blame people. It's a little harder to realize what did they know and what were they dealing with in the heat of the battle. And a similar one to that is outcome bias. Again, where we know the outcome, we tend to judge the decisions and the actions people make far more harshly than if we don't know the outcome. So Decker suggests to us that perhaps instead we should consider the perspectives of the people involved and consider the messy reality that they faced. Try to see the world through their eyes, dealing with the limited amount of knowledge that they had at different points in time. And he encourages us also to remember that most people try to make the best decisions they can under the circumstances. Obviously, they're not trying to come to grief. They're doing the best they can. So he suggests that we need to see their actions through what he calls the lens of good intent. So maybe the right question is not who crashed 1420, but instead what crashed 1420. So let's look at some of the things that were going on that wrapped around this. As I said, the flight was late leaving DFW. They had been working since mid-morning, flying from Chicago to Salt Lake City and then to Dallas, and then holding for traffic, and then they had to change airplanes and all that. So they clearly were tired. And fatigue really does degrade performance, I can promise you. And then, of course, we know the weather was closing in on Little Rock, so the crew had to hurry up and try to get there before the thunderstorms. And this adds to the stress involved and interferes with a careful analysis of the situation. So these are the things that they were dealing with. You know, they had time pressure, they were clearly task saturated. They were tired, they were stressed, they were obviously, I think we can agree, they were probably scared by this because they realized things were going wrong. They had a really high workload all of a sudden with the change from one runway to another and then from a visual approach back to the ILS. Now typically the crew would have had far more exposure to similar situations that always worked out. And this leads to another trap. You know, when your mental model of how things go are that it always works, we always find a way, then it tends to make the threat seem less serious. And so you could kind of see it in some of the crew actions. Their focus seemed to become, is what we're doing legal? Not so much, would we be better off to go do something different? It's not should we do this, but can we do it legally? So when the wind died down and changed direction, Captain Bushman decided to change from 22 to runway 4. This, of course, added to the workload. And they turned them away from the airport so the onboard radar wasn't pointed toward the weather. The reduced wind speed lulled them into thinking things were improving, despite the new mention of wind shear. So by the time the flight maneuvered to the new runway, the storm was already intensifying and moving over the airport. But they got locked into their plan. They were ready to get this airplane on the ground, get the people where they wanted to go, and go to the hotel and go to bed. So they failed to correctly appreciate the severity of the weather. And, you know, when we look at these things, we can see get there itis, stress, high workload, all these things getting in the way. And the fact that the conditions were so variable required constant reevaluation and constant decision making very quickly, preventing them from having time to make careful consideration of what they should be doing, which led in turn to a string of errors, including a misunderstanding of the wind report from the controller, which led them to think the wind was more aligned than it was. Had the crew recognized the fact that the wind exceeded the maximum crosswind limits, they might have discontinued the approach and avoided the accident altogether. Decker went on to say, research shows that airline crews are far more likely to penetrate storm cells when flying after dark and when they're within 10 or 15 miles of the airport, and when they're more than 15 minutes late. And back to my situation that night going into Watson Lake, I was kind of dealing with the same thing. It was getting dark. I was running behind, pushing the time when I wasn't supposed to be flying, and I was tired. I've been going all day long, so I can easily identify the same sort of situation that these guys were dealing with. And they had the same dynamic weather, which was distracting them from completing the before landing checklist. And that led them to fail to arm the spoilers. And, this is, again, sort of human nature. Humans often fail to perform habitual tasks when they're interrupted, distracted, overloaded, or preoccupied. You think about gear up landings. This is a real common thing. It's not that people just blindly forget to put the gear down. It's often happening when they're distracted or interrupted or overloaded or preoccupied. So this is not unusual to miss things on checklist. The other thing I think that bears on this accident is the training these guys received did not match the reality of normal operations. Because in training, for example, with American, the monitoring pilot, the pilot not flying, was the one that was supposed to arm the spoilers. But when they got to looking at how things really happened out on the line, it was the captain who usually went ahead and armed the spoiler handle because it's located on his side of the console. So you can see the disconnect. They trained to do it one way, but out on the line, it's being done differently because it's more convenient. The company policy at the time at American did not require both pilots to visually and verbally confirm arming the spoilers. So the NTSB in their accident analysis went out and started watching American crews, and they observed several spoiler non-deployments during training that were not called out. And in fact, after 1420, there was in fact another directional control incident on a company MD-80 involving spoiler non-deployment. Didn't end up in an accident, but they had trouble with the airplane. So, you might look around the other fleets and you say, well, what are other manufacturers doing? Turns out that most other designs include an automatic spoiler deployment once reverse thrust is selected, regardless of whether somebody armed it or not. It just happens automatically, which makes quite a bit of sense if you think about it. So again, we can see some evidence of a systemic problem here that might have helped these guys out. So back to the approach. It was unstable in several ways. They didn't get the landing configuration set. They weren't laterally aligned very well, and they had a high sink rate. Now, the company had established guidelines for quote-unquote stabilized approaches, but they were only techniques rather than a standard operating practice at the time. They later changed that, but at the time, they just simply said, you guys really ought to be flying a stabilized approach, but they didn't carefully define what that meant, and they didn't make it a hard and fast requirement. So they expected the captain to use their own judgment. So now continuing forward, they get the airplane on the ground, and Captain Bushman uses excessive reverse thrust, which blanked the rudder and decreased rudder effectiveness. So you think, well, okay, what was that all about? Did he do it just because he was scared, or was he not thinking, or what was going on? Well, it turns out that the procedure allows up to 1.6 EPR on dry runways. And since most of the landings that crews make happen on dry runways, it's really easy to forget that the maximum value is lower at 1.3 when the runway is wet or contaminated. So under the pressure of all of this stuff happening, he just did what he always does and just pushed it up to 1.6. But on a wet runway, that caused problems with rudder control. And so the NTSB suggested that the accident crew may have received inadequate training in reverse thrust operations on slippery runways. Probably true. So, what are the key lessons that we get out of this? Well, first of all, I think we have to realize humans are going to make mistakes. But when they do, and this is, all of us that fly can point to situations where we've screwed stuff up. But we have to, I think, be a little kind with people and realize mistakes are not deliberate. We're not doing it on purpose. And in fact, oftentimes are a result of a system problem, not just a lack of skill or just making a mistake. And decisions are often based on emotional factors and imperfect information. We often, this is the way humans work. Under the pressure of things happening really quickly, and particularly when we're surprised or fearful or tired, we often react emotionally rather than logically. So I think we have to give them some credit or cut them some slack and realize that this crew was probably no better nor worse than any others at American. Given enough exposure to similar situations, other crews likely would have crashed as well. So Decker brings out the point that we need to look for ways to improve the system instead of simply blaming the people involved. And we need to be asking what caused the accident instead of asking who caused the accident. And this has a lot of application, I think, to general aviation. All right, so when we think about it, we sort of say, well, what do we take away from this? How does it help us? We don't fly MD-80s. We don't fly for an airline. And you really have to realize that, with GA, we're usually not as well trained. We're oftentimes not as experienced, and we're not equipped the same way. Our aircraft, although they're getting better, they certainly don't have all the system redundancy and capabilities that an airliner has. And quite commonly, we're operating these airplanes single pilot. And we don't usually have anything like a company policy manual that gives us hard and fast limitations on things that we can do or not do. We operate under Part 91, not 121. We're not required to undergo regular training. And we fly more diverse missions. So, all that taking into account, we have to kind of look for things that are keys to success. One of them is that errors are normal, that we should expect that things are going to go wrong, but that we can take action to deal with it. We have to remember that all of us are vulnerable to these biases. We have to recognize the impact of fatigue and stress on our performance. And we have to set realistic and specific personal minimums in terms of weather, wind, fuel, equipment. And we need to establish hard stops early in the mission. And we need to watch out for changes in the environment, especially when we're operating at night or in IMC. And I think we need to pay a little more attention to social pressures. And we talk about those as if it's our passengers that are pressuring us to complete a mission. But I'm suspicious that a lot of times this is internal, not just external. Oftentimes I think we're our own worst enemies. So, how do we deal with this? What can we do from a systemic standpoint to try to figure it out? Well, I think it starts with thinking about how we screw up. One of it is that we realize we operate in really high-risk environments. We do. Aviation is, by its nature, a high-risk environment. And some of us, nobody that's attending this seminar course, might have poor impulse control, and so we continue into situations that we probably, in retrospect, knew we shouldn't have been there. And again, nobody here at this seminar, but some pilots have an assumption of excellence. We think we're better than maybe we really are. And we think we understand what's going on, and sometimes actually that thought about what's happening is really not very well considered. And I don't know about you. I don't know if any of you have ever been in an airplane where you were scared. I can promise you I have been. And when that happens, our brain bandwidth suffers greatly, and we just don't make good decisions when we're stressed. And just like these guys, sometimes technology can be a problem if we don't get it working in our favor. If it's easy for us to miss things, it can lead us to thinking we've got more capability than we do. All right, so again, when we think about from a GA standpoint, how do we help ourselves? Well, we do have a lot of technology. Many of us are now flying with some version of glass cockpits with PFDs and MFD systems that replace our vacuum systems, which are notorious for failing. Many of us have some form of traffic and weather display that's readily available. Engine monitors tell us about developing problems. Modern autopilots are great for reducing in-flight fatigue and flying the airplane precisely. One of the things we ought to be thinking about is training more regularly. And of course, this is a little bit about preaching to the choir, because those of you that are taking the time to attend seminars like this are already probably in the minority. And you're already thinking about smarter ways to do things and probably training more accurately. But when we do training, I think it's important to train in real world conditions of IMC crosswinds and nighttime. And where it's possible and safe, we need to be taking our training scenarios all the way to completion. I teach a lot in Bonanza airplanes, and we do a lot of scenario-based training where we'll do engine failures and we'll actually ask the client to take it all the way to a landing on a runway. So where possible, we try to play it out as far as possible. And then I think it also says we have to watch out for red flags such as interruptions in our routine. We ought to recognize and pay more attention when we're task saturated and when time is getting compressed, when we feel like we're falling behind. That feeling of being rushed is a major red flag, and it leads to lots of problems. And then I think it's important to try to develop a flexible mindset and to, as someone once said, hold the plan gently and be ready to change the plan and to stop the madness. And, by the way, I got to tell you, this is easier to say than it is to do. That night going into Watson Lake, I should have stopped, but I didn't. I pushed on beyond what was safe or smart. And it worked out, and I was lucky I wasn't smart. These are just some examples of where technology hasn't always turned out to be the panacea that we thought it would be. All right, so we talked about some of the ways we succeed: control our impulse, try to develop an ability to be calm in the face of danger, the training and practice, experience, avoiding the vacation state of mind. It's easy to sort of be complacent about things and think because it's always worked out, it'll work out this time. That's part of what leads these airline crews into penetrating convective weather. And we should be wary of success. We need to realize that, hey, just because we've got thousands of hours and it's always worked, that we can't screw up. I guarantee you it can happen. And we have to be recognizing when things are changing. We have to develop the ability to control that emotion and develop personal minimums and predetermined limits that we don't want to exceed. And then when it's called for, when things begin to change, to act decisively to get ourselves out of trouble. That was part of the problem here. These guys never took the opportunity to say, despite the fact that it was going to be a big hassle, they could have easily diverted somewhere else or gone back to Dallas, and everybody would have got home safely that night. And, one thing I think it bears repeating or thinking about is that these concepts that we're talking about, we tend to think these are sort of aviator type things, but they're not. The same sort of issues happen with people who are sailors, who are doctors and surgeons, mountain climbers. Many, many other highly qualified, experienced folks face the same challenges and sometimes come to grief in the same ways. And to Decker's point, I think we have to be careful about blaming others, because next time it could be us. And I think we have to look beyond just blaming people when somebody makes a mistake, and we have to look for ways that we can improve the system that we operate in. Look for solutions that maybe backs it up to where we aren't as vulnerable to those same kind of mistakes. And we need to understand the traps if we're going to find the pleasure and the treasures that come from being a GA pilot. So, as you see there, challenges come for all of us, and learning how to react and decide is critical to survival. So that's really the presentation. So at this point, Chris and Jeremy, if we can, let's open it up to any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And you guys need to unmute. There you go, Jeremy.
Hey, sorry. I had to run to take care of a 2-year-old. First question. Chris is going to ask the second. So I know this. I've got my definition. I want to hear Ken's definition, and it's probably going to be similar to mine. What is culture, and what can we as aviation educators and fellow pilots do to propagate a positive safety culture from a collective community perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's really a pertinent question in today's environment. We don't have to look very far to get good and bad examples of how the culture is impacted by social media. Now, you look at the things that are going on with Trent Palmer and previously with Trevor Jacob, the Red Bull team, and all the things that are kind of at the front of the news in general aviation activities right now. And it's easy to find social media that sort of celebrates things that we would, I think most of us agree, to be not very smart or not very safe. So, and you know, this is coming from a guy who loves being in the backcountry and in the wilderness and doing things that a lot of people would think were highly dangerous. I get it. Sort of everybody has to figure out where their own limits are. But I think we have to be careful about the sources of information we pick and the people we look to for role models and for guidance. And so I think if we pick wisely, then we can avoid some of the more radical and unfortunate sources of information that are out there. So that's about all I'll say about that. What about Chris? What do you think?
Hey Ken, I had a question for you.
Sure.
What's your thoughts on pilots deviating from their checklists? I mean, I know GA, we get used to our simple checklists all the time, the same plane we fly. And some guys do deviate from their checklists, but on the commercial side, like this example we had with the crash there, the spoilers, for example, what will make a pilot or a co-pilot, kind of skip over some parts of the checklist?
Well, I think what happened to these guys was very typical, and it can happen to any of us, and that
Right.
is in the face of all of these things going wrong, they just got behind. They were, a guy told me one time when I was training, he said, "I got good news and bad news," and I said, "Well, okay, what's the good news? Or I'm sorry, what's the bad news?" He said, "Well, you're way behind the airplane." And I said, "Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm really struggling here." I said, "What's the good news?" He said, "Well, the only good news I can think of is if we have a midair, you won't get hurt because you're so far behind the airplane." And I thought, well, that doesn't make me feel much better. But yeah, so I don't think they skipped it because they were just being inattentive or because they had gotten complacent. I think what drove them to miss it was just they didn't have enough time, and they were scrambling to try to get everything done with all the changes that they were dealing with.
Makes a lot of sense.
Fatigue, get there-itis at the end of the duty day, it all affects your judgment and your tolerance to want to make a good decision. And
again, to Decker's point, and I think this is the crux of this, is we need to look for ways that the system could have been improved. Maybe more hard and fast guidance about don't get that close to the weather. And when you are fatigued, there should be no problem with speaking up and deciding, hey, it's getting late and we're tired, and so we've got to be even more conservative, even if it means we can't get the flight to its destination. But there's an unwritten pressure that happens with
Yes.
professional crews that says, even though everybody says, yeah, it's okay if you don't complete the mission, subtly everybody's thinking, well, why couldn't they get it done? What's wrong with them? You know, a good crew would have made it happen. So we're fighting that kind of stuff either externally or internally all the time.
You know, we saw that type of thing happen with the Colgan air crash up in Buffalo.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And that was another example of fatigue and pressure to get the job done. One of the things that Chris was talking about was checklist usage and why people forget things on their checklist. And sometimes it is because people are, you know, anti-authority and they're macho and they want to avoid using checklists. But then there are professional pilots who fail to capture all the things on the checklist because they do get distracted. It's very easy to get caught up in the fog of war, a phrase that I'm familiar with that some of us in the military from the past have referred to as the busyness of being distracted, to be distracted during the middle of a checklist run and come back to it. You come back to the wrong step in the checklist and completely forget it. That's very easy to do.
Right. Absolutely.
Cognition.
There's a lot of great safety things available to GA now over the last 10 years with weather. I mean, I know ADSB is about 5-7 minutes old. But as a GA pilot, you can even get XM weather. That's pretty much accurate. So there's a lot of things at GA's fingertips, even just using an iPad, for example, or ForeFlight, the very simple stuff that gets us out of trouble, you know, as a GA pilot, whether you're certified in IFR or not. So a lot of great things. And I know you mentioned, Ken, like a lot of glass these days and stuff that's coming out. The prices are coming down. That's all information. If you have the glass panel at your fingertips as a GA pilot, especially like you said, Ken, a lot of us do single pilot all the time. And then some of us will have autopilot, some do, especially if you're an IMC as a single pilot. So a lot of the stuff that's out there is very, very good for GA. And I think, you know, with the FAA and other odds and ends with these programs and iPads and ForeFlight, for example, with these programs, it's very good for GA pilots in 2022.
You know, it is without a doubt. If we look back, say even 10 years ago, I don't think any of us would want to go back to the systems we had at that point, right? But there are two other things I would suggest that need to be considered. One of them is something that I put on screen just in passing, which is called risk homeostasis. And what that means is humans have a tendency, when they have more capability, to push deeper into circumstances because they think they have that improved capability.
Right.
You know, anti-lock brakes came out, airplane parachutes on Cirrus airplanes, all of those sort of things. It seemed like we expected a big reduction in accidents, and when it didn't happen, we were kind of puzzled by it. Well, it just turns out people just push harder because they feel like they've got more capability. The other thing is all of the magic that we have is wonderful, but it adds a burden of constant training to be familiar, and we have to not get so dependent on the automation that we can't hand fly.
Sure.
I have seen time after time on practical tests where people had all this technology and because they're nervous, because it's a test, they make one mistake. They push one button incorrectly, and now they are so lost in trying to unsnarl it that they absolutely get behind the airplane and end up oftentimes, you know, getting a disapproval. Right. Because they just couldn't deal with the fact that this thing that was working so beautifully a few seconds ago is now just all snarled up. So, and that can happen in IMC as well. You know, you get one thing bollocksed up, and all of a sudden you're really struggling to figure out what went wrong.
Bob asked a really good question, and I'm going to ask it from the lens that you mentioned in your presentation. He said, using American Airlines 1420 as a teaching moment, what would you have under different done differently under the same circumstances? In other words, what would you have done with, what would have been your way out? But look, and I want to caveat onto that. What would you have done in that circumstance, not knowing what the outcome of that circumstance would be?
Well, you know, I think that, again, I don't want to keep beating this over and over again, but I think what we tend to do is we tend to say, well, this crew just screwed up, and that they were somehow neglectful, and that they probably were not very competent compared to the typical American Airlines crew. And I think that's really short-sighted. I think any crew, given the same array of factors, could easily find themselves kind of deep in the weeds and really struggling with this. So I think we have to be careful about that. The other thing that Decker tells us in his book is we need to look beyond just assessing blame, and we need to look for ways that we can improve the system itself. So I mentioned the auto spoiler thing, where a lot of the later iteration of airline equipment, the auto spoilers deploy no matter what. You can't miss it in the checklist. If you don't arm them, they're going to come out as soon as you go to reverse thrust. So that's an example of how the system could be improved. The other would be developing a culture within the community of pilots, particularly in a company like that, to make sure it's absolutely okay to say, hey, we're more tired than we should be, and we really probably need to do something more conservatively. But you know, we could look back and kind of, this is his point about outcome bias. When you know they screwed up, it's really easy to feel like, well, you know, what were they thinking? But it's when you're in the middle of it and things are changing like that, and you're having to make decisions literally on the fly, it's real easy to see yourself making the same mistakes.
Yes, absolutely. Over reliance on technology and getting sucked into that trap. Fly the airplane if all else fails. Turn off the autopilot and hand fly. This is a really popular topic, and I think we saw that with that Aviation 777 that crashed into San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. What's your thoughts on the over reliance of technology? I know we touched a little bit on that.
Well, I think there's been a general feeling in the professional pilot community that we had gone too far. The pendulum had swung too far toward automation, and that we weren't asking or allowing people enough opportunity to hand fly. And I think that has been addressed. I think there's more emphasis put on it, both in the recurrent training that they're getting and also probably in line operations. But again, I'm not an airline guy, so I can't tell you that for sure. But you're right, the avionic crash at San Francisco caused a bunch of people to say, wait a minute, we really aren't where we need to be in terms of making sure people can either drive the automation or fly the airplane.
Right. The automation can either work against us or for us. It just depends on us as the commanders of our aircraft and our machines as to whether we're going to allow it to fly us or we're going to use it to our advantage. Chris, what you got? Chris?
Yes.
You got a question?
I'm thinking. Yeah, he answered a lot of questions in between the questions I was trying to answer. He answered them for me as he was going along. That's why I wrote those questions out, and he answered them for me.
No, that's all good. The issues with distractions, nobody is immune to those distractions. And you know, you hit the nail on the head about how gear up landings can occur. I mean, it's very easily for that to happen. I mean, some senior and professional guys can get distracted during the landing sequence, landing checklist, and miss that step and be busy looking for traffic and with the gear folded up in the well. I mean, we saw that. We saw that on a practical test with a citation, I believe it was, in 7 left in Daytona a few years ago. Um, And, you know, you got two senior guys on an aircraft and they land gear up. It's very easy to do. Let's see what else. What's that?
That happened at Orange County with an L-39.
Yeah. Let's see.
Well, I saw an example just a couple of days ago. Guy flying a 182, and it had an older autopilot in it, and it didn't have an autopilot disconnect on the yoke, and he was making a VFR approach and landing, going to do a short field landing, and he kept making comments about the airplane didn't feel right, and I didn't catch it either, but he landed and it was okay, and then he realized he'd forgotten to turn the autopilot off. So the autopilot was running in the background, and it was, you know, interfering with his control field. It didn't create a huge problem, but it was just an example where he'd missed it in his pre-landing check that he didn't turn the autopilot off. Had it been a more powerful autopilot, it could have been a bigger problem.
Right. Right. And then some autopilots require that you have them turned off prior to a certain AGL above the airport because of that reason.
Most of them do, right?
Yes. Please address the hierarchy in this cockpit. How did it affect the choices? That was a question.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to know. The NTSB didn't really say much about it, but my sense of it would have been that is a different stressor. If you're that young new hire and you're flying with a check airman, you're not likely, even though the crew concept says, you know, you're supposed to be catching each other and double checking and pointing out if somebody's making a mistake. It seems logical to me that in that environment it'd be really difficult to second guess the captain's decisions.
I have a question for Ken.
Go ahead.
What's your feeling on? I know it's a hot topic with a lot of people. What's your feeling on ADS-B, the mandate? I'm for it. I think it's a good idea. You know, but a lot of guys are not for it, especially the old timers. What's your opinion on the ADS-B? I think it's a good safety tool. What's your opinion on that?
Well, Jeremy and I will both probably admit to a little bit of a jaundiced opinion about the regulation involved, but I think the technology is absolutely a wonderful tool. I do. I think the two things about it. One, we have to be careful that we don't get overly dependent on it because not all aircraft are equipped. Right. And certainly it doesn't mean that we're not going to have to look outside for, you know, birds and stuff like that. And again, it's tempting to get complacent because we think we're seeing all the traffic. So that's one. My comment about the regulatory part is I am bothered by some of the things that we keep getting anecdotal evidence about the FAA violating people because of the ADS-B information.
I've heard that.
And so I think that has to be watched carefully, just to make sure that we don't, in fact, find that abuses are occurring because of that technology.
I mean, my personal thing on that, I fly in, you know, the Northeast all the time, and New York City's by me. And I like the fact that, you know, I always still look outside, especially in VFR conditions. And I like the fact that I get a head start on traffic. Yeah. So that, you know, even if I'm on flight following, sometimes I see the traffic before ATC tells me there's traffic, or if I'm not even using flight following. But that's a good head start that you notice traffic out there, whether 10 miles away, whatever it is. Now you can kind of zone around and try to find that traffic before it gets too close to you. As long as they have the ADS-B, a majority of New York, especially in New York City, you have to have the ADS-B to fly in those areas. Right. So that's what I like about it, for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that really bothers me about the ADS-B culture is what you said, Ken, about people becoming more over-reliant on using it to find other traffic, because there are airplanes that are flying now that still don't require ADS-B. And on top of that is it creates this tendency of people to want to come into the cockpit, especially entering a non-towered airport pattern. I was doing a flight review a while back with one guy, and you know, there was aircraft in the pattern, and instead of looking outside and seeing, avoiding as we're required to do per the regulation, he trailed his eyes inside into his iPad. Well, that's a bad recipe right there.
Absolutely.
That is a pitfall of this ADS-B culture that we have right there. I mean,
that system does lag a little bit too. It's not exactly where traffic's going to be.
Well, it goes back to that comment about over-reliance into automation. It can either work for us or against us. And ADS-B is one of those things that is a wonderful thing, but it can have disadvantages and limitations, and it can create a culture. How many people know how to pull out an E6B? I want to get Trace to come on and teach a class on how to use an E6B, by the way. That's a joke between him and I. But how many people know how to use an E6B, a plotter, and a sectional these days and do it the old-fashioned way? And, everybody uses ForeFlight. So, I'm afraid that a lot of our basic skills are starting to deteriorate as airmen.
Well, I think one of the things that instructors have an obligation to do on flight reviews is to look for ways that they can help their clients go back and refresh their ability to fly without a lot of the magic. If we constantly, let's take an instrument pilot, if they're most always coupling up all the automation and flying approaches, then we have to, I think, ask them to show that they can do without it, and to do things with systems failed and creative scenarios that are realistic, but that challenge those folks to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and maybe step back away from some of all of that help and fly the airplane visually, just looking out the window, for example. It's real tempting to get completely away from that. And I think we have, as instructors, we have an obligation to help people, remind them that they really do need to keep those skills intact.
I agree.
Absolutely.
What do we have? I'm just looking, sorry for the awkward pause, but I want to make sure that I don't miss anybody who might have dropped a question in here that we should address. There's a lot of comments in the chat. Are any airlines considering a rule that one pilot has to be relatively pressure? No, that I can answer. And do both pilots have to be together all day long during the day? No. That's, pilots get changed out frequently based off of the needs of the crew. So, and of course, part 121 and part 135 rest rules are different. And that came as a result of that Kogan Air accident. Part 117 is where you can find those rules. Let's see. Did this accident result in any procedure change to the airline? What year did this happen? It was in 1990s.
99, and yes, there were a number of things that changed at American in terms of things that, for example, the requirement on stabilized approach was one of them. It had been, recommended and sort of taught as a technique. It became a requirement. And if the airplane wasn't stabilized within whatever the parameters were they gave, a go-around was automatic. I mean, they had to do it. And so they tried to formalize, that was just one of them. I think the other with the spoiler arming and the fact that normally the captains were doing it, even though that wasn't the way it was taught, I think they went back and rethought that. And then, of course, as they replaced the MD-80s, the newer airplanes had the automation, the spoiler activation automatically. You got to remember that this crew would not have probably continued to a landing if they had not misunderstood the wind.
Yeah.
They misunderstood the wind direction, and so they didn't realize that they had as severe a crosswind as they had. Had they heard that correctly, then they would have probably aborted the landing and gone somewhere else. But this is one of the things that happens when you're highly stressed. You just don't hear. You miss calls. We've all done it. When you're really busy and you're working hard and ATC calls, a lot of times you just didn't hear it. And I think that's what happened in this case.
Link in the chain. Several links in the chain.
Yeah.
I think there's a question there from Marissa, Jeremy.
Let's see. I'm looking. How do we as flight instructors deal with the pressures from GA pilots to sign off a flight review or an IPC when they clearly aren't qualified? GA pilots are also guilty of downplaying the need for proficiency and think they can get a quick sign off. That is a good question.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that going around. I have a number of thoughts, sort of a broader answer and then a more specific answer. The more specific answer would be to manage expectations on the front end and say to the client when they first contact the instructor for a flight review, just make it clear to them that here's what the expectations are, and that unless it's completed successfully, they're going to have to come back for additional training, and that means extra cost. So having a syllabus is a big help. You can show that syllabus to the client and say, here are the things that we're going to cover. Part of it is a list of things that's sort of a laundry list that should be probably in any flight review. And then there's another section that would be customized to the individual client and the kind of equipment they're flying, the kind of missions they're flying, and so forth. But I think a conversation on the front end that says, here's how I see a flight review for you as a client, and here's the things I would want to make sure and cover, and here are the standards that I expect that the FAA and I both agree come right out of, for example, the ACS, that any flight review ought to at least meet the minimum requirements per the ACS that's applicable for that pilot certificate and ratings. It doesn't need to turn into a check ride. It needs to be a coaching and a mentoring session. But I think we have to be real honest with people that says, this matters. And if you're looking for a quick sign off at an hour of ground and an hour of flight, probably I'm not your guy. And I think you need to think about whether you really think that's in your best interest or not. From a broader standpoint, I think what we need to be doing, and this is what we do with wings programs and with some of the type clubs such as the BPT and BPPP, we try to encourage people to train more regularly rather than wait and just do it as a flight review, but do it on a periodic, ongoing basis. And if you have an instructor who's motivated and creative, you can make it fun for the client and get them to come back to you every 6 months and do a bit of work.
Here's a good question, because we didn't hear a lot about this. What was the role of the dispatcher in the accident? How come this flight was dispatched to the airport with such forecasted weather?
Well, again, I can't tell you because I don't have an airline background, but I think the dispatchers are providing information, but they're generally not going to make the go no go decisions. And in convective weather, we all have been there. It's dynamic. It changes rapidly, and in this case, the dispatcher indicated that right at the time they left Dallas, they had a clear path to Little Rock. The weather had not intruded on the airport at that point, but it was conveyed to them, sort of subtly, that you better hurry up, because the longer you take to get there, the worse it's going to be. It is getting more active and it's moving in the direction of going to the airport. So I think both the subtle and maybe not so subtle indication was, you need to get on with it or you're going to get trapped in the weather. But I think rightly that the decisions need to be vested in the crew. They're closest to it, and they need to be making that evaluation of the dynamics of the situation, and you just have to trust their training, and you give them parameters, and then you give them the training, and then you expect them to make the right decisions.
Chris, you got any questions?
I'm all caught up, my friend.
Ken, you got anything you want to add before we close it out?
No,
Brian?
I just think I think it's an interesting way for all of us to look at our operations, and in one sense, not maybe to be so hard on each other about figuring that when people screw up that they somehow were lacking. That I think it bears some thought to realize we're all vulnerable to making these same kind of mistakes, and that we need to look for these systemic ways that we can avoid being in those situations. You know, this idea of personal minimums that we talk about a lot, and the idea of proper use of technology, um, running of checklists, recognizing the onset of these traps of fatigue and time pressures and cultural pressures and things of that type. If we're aware of it, that's the first step in actively making plans and taking steps to not be in that circumstance or that situation. We just have to realize we're human and we're going to make mistakes, and we have to do all these things that we can to try to prevent them from cascading into an accident.
Aware, avoid, recognize, and recover is what I always like to teach. You know, it's who's right, not it's not what who's right, but what's right is what I always like to say, or what a lot of the captains and senior flight instructors that I've met have always wanted to say that are professionals. What is Ken's definition of a professional pilot?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about the characteristics of professionalism tonight. You know, I think one of the I've been very blessed in having gotten an opportunity to fly with some people that are just amazing aviators. And the ones that stick out in my mind, I think without almost exception, are the ones that are very quietly humble in their approach to things. They understand they're competent, but they also understand that complacency can bite any of them, and they tend to take a very curious approach to wanting to learn more, to be better at the craft, and to be completely aware of the fact that you know, any of us can make a mistake that can end badly. Those are the folks that I want to fly with, not the ones that have thought they figured it out already.
Every time that I felt like in my career that I had it figured out, something has come along and bit me in the tail and reminded me that I'm just starting.
Yeah, it happens to all of us.
All right. Well,
I'm off to a trip. Be out of pocket for a couple of weeks, but if anybody has any questions, they can certainly reach out. I'd be happy to visit with them, and we can carry this on.
Wonderful. Well, we'll have you back. And
be safe, Ken.
All right, thanks, guys.
See ya.
All right, thanks again, Ken. I'm going to go ahead and close out the program for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks everybody for joining in tonight. I want to thank Ken bringing his outstanding content, expertise to the program, and professionalism. And I also want to thank Chris for joining in. Pilot Fund 101. He owns a beautiful Mooney, and he has some excellent video content on YouTube, and he flies around in New York area. And Chris, I really appreciate you joining and helping.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, if any of you guys have any questions, please feel free to shoot me a note at flyallamerican@gmail.com. Be sure to follow my aviation YouTube channel on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and also check out Chris's. Chris, I'm sorry I didn't put it on this page, but it's Pilot Fund 101. And then come back and join us on May the 19th at 7:30 p.m. I'll send the link out as we welcome Mike Bush back to Breaking the Chain, and he'll bring his wonderful expertise. This will be the final Breaking the Chain until we go into the summer months. I'll be taking a hiatus for various reasons. Thanks again tonight. the best way to predict your future is to create it, says President Abraham Lincoln. Have a wonderful night, ladies and gentlemen. Fly safe, keep learning, and never give up on a dream. So long.